Hello. My name is Mike Tresca. I am your host for the CAR-PGA. We are excited to get some great housekeeping items where we will just do an overview because it's been a little bit and a lot of exciting things have happened. And then we are going to interview our distinguished guest. I can't wait to do that. I'm super excited to talk to our guest as well. But we have some housekeeping, and we actually have uh, board members, former board members, and current board members. So we're going to let Mr. Millions tell us the latest results of voting and introduce that more formally. I think we've already talked about in the newsletter, but since we have everybody here, we thought that would be a great opportunity. So with that, sir, I will hand it over to you. You're muted. There you
Naturally.
go.
All right. After elections, voting and tabulations in January and February, the board for CAR-PGA for 2024 is composed of David Hartless, myself, Hawk Robinson, Mike Tresca, and Alan White, which gives us a full board of five again.
Very excited. And we're very excited to have Mr. Skirvin, Ted Skirvin, with us as well. And we thank him for all his work. And we just told him that we missed him. He's like, "What are you talking about? I'm right here." But, but that's because we met from the board, but we appreciate him. And he was so gracious as to allow other folks, frankly, to get an opportunity. So that's great. And David, you left out the other part. We voted committee chair,
We did vote
not me.
committee chair, and
Uh-huh.
you, Mike Tresca, were elected chair again. Thank you for your service in advance and retroactively.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. So, thank you for that. Yes, so I'm excited to be your chair again. Certainly, we're going to continue these videos in any case through the end of this year for sure, at least. So I'm very pleased to continue that role. So you'll continue to hear me from me at writing a newsletter and hosting these videos. But as we've mentioned before, that's not required for chair, right? So as David has mentioned, Ted and I have had this discussion as well. You don't have to do what I do. So we don't want to have that prohibit people from potentially applying for this kind of role. So again, the committee chair is voted from the board. But I will say personally, I was very pleased to see the voting was pretty high. Right, David? I thought that was great. We saw quite a few. We had a little bit of spam, but that aside, we did see quite a few members vote, which is huge and healthy. So
It's the
I think
largest
that's great.
turnout I think I've ever seen.
Oh,
Um,
really?
and the voting was pretty close. So
That's fantastic. So I'm excited. I appreciate you all voting. It's the best gift I could ask for. I am not looking to be voted in, frankly. I am looking to have participation. That's what we needed to see. So we saw it, which was fantastic. So I'm happy to do that. Okay. Anything else, David? I think I covered that, right? Anything? Did I miss anything? No, we're good. So it is my pleasure to introduce our guest who has been waiting patiently. Um, Dr. Stephen Dashiell, Dr. Stephen Dashiell. I said that right the second time.
Yep.
Hello.
Hello.
Welcome, welcome.
My pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So we've had this scheduled for, I don't know, like 4 months.
Something.
And it took a little bit of scheduling. You were gracious enough to accept. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time. As always, we're very excited to have you here. Your work in particular, I think, is going to be very interesting to a lot of our members. As I had mentioned, we have everything from gaming scholars, certainly teachers, therapists, just game developers and designers on as part of our membership, which has grown quite a bit, as David reminded me recently, because I was like, oh, we're like 15, 20. And he's like, no, we're like 40 plus. So we have quite a few members. And I think a lot of your work is absolutely relevant. So what we like to do, usually just to get us warmed up and get started, is just to have you talk a little bit about yourself and sort of your gaming interests. You know, it doesn't always, sometimes we've asked this question, it doesn't have to be exactly how you got into gaming, but sort of your perspective on why it's interesting to you and how you came up to end up focusing on it as a discipline specifically. So we'd love to hear your background to the extent you're willing
Oh,
to share.
sure, absolutely. So, my background in tabletop gaming started probably at the age of 12, so 35 years ago. And I went to the one bookstore in my town that actually sold D&D books. And they sold the box editions of Dungeons and Dragons. And I couldn't find the red box. I couldn't find the basic set. So I got the expert set.
Mhm.
And I read through the expert set voraciously. I just absorbed it and was so much in love. But none of my friends wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons. So I just read the books over and over again and dog-eared the books for months until a comic book store opened in my town. And when I went, they had a back room where I looked and I saw people were actually rolling 20-sided die. And it's like, it's gaming. So I made a plan a week later to go to the bookstore and play in the game, brought my D&D books, sat down, so happy to play, and they were playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And I had no idea what they were talking because it's like, wait a minute, no, there are only 3 alignments. What are you talking about? 9 alignments. And what's a barbarian? Because none of this stuff makes sense to me. This is not the game that I understood. So I had to go through this entire process of relearning and not understanding what was going on at the table. There were dynamics going on at the table that it took me a while to pick up on. And I only bring that story up because part of the things that I talk about in my research, particularly meta discourse, when I talk about the conversations that happen at the table that aren't about the game, but wouldn't be happening if not for the game. So,
Mhm.
for example, when I went to that first game, everybody was talking about like Monty Python and the Holy Grail jokes, which I'd never even heard of Monty Python. But everybody got the joke, and I'm just like, I don't get it. Wait, grenade? I don't understand. So it was recognizing that there was a level of familiarity and there was base level of knowledge that really didn't have to do with the games or the game books, that you really needed to interact with the people around the table and to feel a level of comfort. And so those conversations, those are what I refer to as meta discourse. And one of the papers I wrote is talking about that. So that's how I got into gaming, and that stuck in the back of my mind for a while. How I got into researching gaming, I was working on my master's degree, and I decided, I remember this was 2008, 2007, when there were still talk shows that were coming on, like Ricky Lake and shows like that. And I remember
Yep.
this one show of, I lost my husband to World of Warcraft. And I remember thinking, what is World of Warcraft? And then I learned more and more about it. I actually watched that episode. I learned more and more about it. And I had not decided what I wanted to do my master's thesis, my final paper for my master's on. But I went to my advisor, who I did not know at the time was one of the most known people in the country for games research at that time, and said, I want to do research on this game. I hear it's called World of Warcraft. And she's like, oh, yeah, lots of people are doing research on WoW right now, so maybe that's something you should do. Yeah, that sounds like it's interesting. And I'm like, yes, this is going to be interesting to find out like why people play this game and why they lose time in this game and why relationships are breaking up. She's like, okay, have you ever played the game? I'm like, no, why would I need to play the game? I just want to study people who are playing the game. No, I want sociological distance. She's like, no, you need to go play the game. I downloaded the game on a Sunday. I remember it very clearly downloading WoW on a Sunday in 2008. I called into work sick for the next 2 days because I played nonstop for 72 hours. I
Holy
was
cow.
by that game. I could not believe at that time the whole idea of like this unending world with all of these quests and real people. I mean, I still remember like Dark Heart of Ukrol on CompuServe, which was
Mhm.
all like text. And it's like, so you're interacting with people, but there are no pictures, there are no graphics, there are no anything. So this was just amazing to me. And I ended up following up with that research. I did my master's paper on World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft actually in 2008 had an academic conference that occurred on World of Warcraft.
Oh,
So the
wow.
biggest names in the world all went to World of Warcraft, all joined one guild, and they had an actual conference that was on World of Warcraft, standing in what's it called, Booty Bay, and there were people just talking throughout the entire time, and it was the most amazing thing. And I'm just like standing back there like a fanboy, like I have no idea what's going on, but this is so awesome. And that told me that gaming was important and it was something I wanted to do. However, when I went for my PhD about 4 or 5 years later, I really wasn't looking towards games because my program director at the time told me, if you study games, I'm not going to be on your dissertation committee. And there's a whole story behind that. It's not
Mm-hmm.
like she hates games. She just knew that if I did a dissertation on games, another person would be on it, and she didn't want that person on my committee. So she's like, sure, you can study games. She's like, I'm not going to have anything to do with your work. I'm like, oh, okay. So I'm not going to study games, but I still was interested in games. That's when bronies came up in my second year of my PhD program. But I went to present a paper actually on Magic the Gathering, because even though my research was not on games, everything I did for all of my classes were on games.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up doing an observation of Magic the Gathering, looked at, and then took that paper to the Popular Culture Association meeting, and then realized that PCA had dozens of panels on game studies, and I was just in heaven. There, I met some really big names in game studies, and they were so friendly and they were so inviting. At that conference, I got invited to like 3 other conferences that year, all of which I went to. And so I had this parallel world where I was doing dissertation research, which was actually on veterans, but also doing research on games at the same time. And it just kind of bled through that. Most of the research that I've had published has been on games, and I'm interested very much in game culture. I always say some people study gamers, some people study games. I study the culture surrounding games. And so that's the thing I'm interested in. I apologize, that's so long-winded, but
Wow,
I just
that's
feel like I
fantastic.
have 2 Sophia Petrillo stories about me and gaming, so I just wanted to tell them.
I love it. Yeah, we two stories to that effect. My elementary school slash early high school. No, it must have been an early high school group. Almost split apart, torn apart because of the basic versus advanced question, where
Wow.
I had relatives who didn't know any better and would buy me the advanced books, and we were playing basic, the basic sort of series. And I finally figured it out. Like you said, you were like, "There's not. It does. It's actually not even compatible. It's like two different systems." And it was right around Masters, the Masters set, and I was like, "We have to switch." And they're like, "I don't want to switch." And like a huge fight, high school drama fight erupted over transition. So I feel it because, like you said, it is a shock. Like because again, it's so easy in retrospect for people to talk about these things. You're like, you don't have to. You have to understand. Nobody knew. They just heard Dungeons and Dragons and didn't understand, and there were very different games, and
Right.
it felt like you were growing up if you were playing advanced, right? Because it was advanced.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing is, I'm actually an administrator for Retro Month today, which is going to celebrate its 40th anniversary. So we've been running a multi-user dungeon, text-based, for 40 years straight.
Wow.
So yeah, so we have my text-based game. We were just like, we probably should do something for our 40th anniversary. So kudos to you. It means you get it. I do find it ironic now with AI that it's like text is back. It's just who's texting you now.
Yeah,
It's just the machine talks, not the person. But it is kind of
absolutely.
funny. So yeah, and as I mentioned, your focus on, what I would broadly and probably not appropriately say geek culture, I think is
Oh, that
tremendously,
works.
yeah. I mean, because there's so many elements, right? Like, yeah, ponies, Magic the Gathering, World of Warcraft, Dungeons and Dragons, they're all loosely in the zone, but they absolutely are parts of the culture, and certainly they, as we were saying before we started, uh, you know, My Little Pony has definitely Dungeons and Dragons influences. Certainly, Magic the Gathering is now owned by Hasbro as well, by Wizards of the Coast. Take your pick. There's a through line through almost all of those.
Yeah.
So that's great. And so then now obviously that was your work, and it sounds like you found your community of people. Um, and you it's actually quite diverse, right? What you've covered, which I think is fantastic, because as you said, that it's not just the one thing. You can go in multiple directions now. I think geek culture has expanded. Frankly, it's taken over the world, so you probably go and talk about just about most topics. But it really is interesting to see how you've, I think, evolved along with it, where you were able to go, well, let me talk about this. Well, there's this going on. There's this subculture. So you've definitely had your range of interests, right? You've covered bronies. We're talking role players, card gamers. Um, that's, I think, probably tells you a lot about the groups themselves, what they play, and sort of where they come from. So, yeah, look, there's no way we're going to be able to cover all in detail all of your amazing work. We will certainly send the links out that links to some of the stuff that you've done. And some of it, I think you just have to read, right? But you've certainly hit on a few specific topics in that subculture. So what did you learn, right? So broadly, again, me using the umbrella phrase geek culture, what did you learn from that in terms of both commonalities and differences?
So one of the well, it's interesting because I come to my studies basically with the things that I've learned in my PhD program, which are looking at power relationships highly tied to issues of gender. And one of the things that I've learned is in all of these spaces that I've studied is there is an idealization of masculine elements that people are expected to apply in their operation of these different, whether it's bronies or Magic the Gathering or D&D or the military, what have you. There is this preferred way to behave that is very much linked to how men already behave. And so if you come into it with a masculine background, it's not really a hard sell. Eric Dunning, back in the 1970s, he was a sports sociologist. He talked about the concept of male preserves, and he said that there are these spaces that don't keep other people out, but that the rules to operate in these spaces are very masculine. And so if people who don't fall into the masculine box want to operate in these spaces, they either need to act masculine or shut up and sit down. Those are really the only choices that and he would give the example of a rugby bar, that if you're at a bar, which is a rugby bar where there's going to be rugby songs, there's going to be rugby hijinks, there's a very masculine kind of, what does he refer to it as? Laddish way in which individuals act. Women aren't closed out of that, but women would be like, what is going on? And so it's more like you need to go with the flow and you need to understand the rules. But because of the masculine leading in these spaces, if you come in with a masculine background, you kind of already understand the rules. And it's easier to adapt to them. And a lot of the rules, like I have a chapter under review right now in a book where I'm talking about some of the things that are discussed on RPG Stack Exchange and these discursive elements of masculine discursive elements that are related to who has authority in these spaces where people are arguing about the game. And some of those elements are attribution, like to be able to say, oh, on page 114 of blah, 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 this is where you look to do this. There's also experience. Back when I had a similar experience like this, blah, blah, blah. And there's also, now I've forgotten what the third one was, but it's all related to masculine discourse. And that, again, individuals who are not experienced and exposed to these kind of masculine ideals and norms, they learn to adapt. But what that lends to is a circumstance where we get into this belief, oh, well, women didn't play X. They did. But because they were using the same normative behavior and acting in those same spaces as men were, they were easily erased. So when we look through the history, for example, of D&D, we can see plenty of women. But I know, like when I did an analysis of some articles in Dragon Magazine, that there were plenty of women, but if there were names that were ambiguous, if there were names that were gender neutral, people just assumed it was a man. Nobody assumed it was a woman unless she identified herself in the piece as a woman. And that could be beneficial, that could be detrimental. So a lot of my research looks at this idea of these understandings of power and power relationships, how a lot of them are based on gender and gender capital and things like that, but they're also based on other things. And like linguistic capital, for example. And in one of my papers, I talk about the linguistic capital of rules lawyering and how it takes up so much time, but in many circumstances, nobody's trying to stop it. I mean, how many times do we just let rules lawyering go until it slowly but surely dies out? Because it's a contest of attribution and knowledge. And it is something that can be frustrating to individuals, but it's something that you kind of learn as part of the game.
Right. And to your point, potentially has gender elements even in that, right? Which people are asserting dominance or showing knowledge and welcome to the internet. Like, if you want to talk about lose lawyering, I'm assuming Stack Exchange is part of why you're bringing that up, which is
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, to that point, I mean, a lot of sociolinguists that look at issue of gender and communication, there's knowledge that in gender socialization, women are commonly taught in Western society when somebody's talking over you, you get quiet. But rules lawyering is all about talking over. It's not waiting your turn. It's you talk over the person to say that's wrong and this is why it's wrong. So it's a learned skill that from a point of view of gender, women have to learn to operate in that space. Or if you come from a household where you always defer to people in power. I mean, I came from an African-American household where you did not talk over my father because he clearly knew more than anybody else. So I spent a lot of my time, even when I probably knew as much as the DM in my gaming, of just deferring to the DM because it's like he's the authority figure and I'm not supposed to say anything. So taking some of my cultural elements over with me into the game until I started to realize, what do you think you know? I know more than you. But that took years, years upon years.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I've talked a lot about the idea behind basically being able to sit around a table, the table dynamic, right? So, I mean, like you said, put the head of the household at the front of the table, put the DM at the front of the table. There's not a whole lot of difference necessarily in how that power dynamic feels when you're sitting at a table and there's meals or snacks and and so what's your closest, right? It's probably
Yeah.
the dinner table. So there's a lot of sort of parallels there in how people act and speak. And certainly, as my wife is fond of telling me, because we're Italian Americans, we just yell over each other constantly. And she's like, "Can I speak, please? Can any of you stop talking for 5 seconds?" So there's a lot of those challenges, and believe me, we've looked into this at length, right? One of the things that I think has come up, and I think it's fantastic that you've been delving into this, was very much what's all this, we need player tools for comfort levels and making sure people are comfortable. And why do they need to be comfortable? I didn't have to be. I'm comfortable, and I don't play with people who potentially have a problem with the game. And so for my game, most recently, I actually made a series of warnings on what was going to be in it, which forced me to think about how I play and why did I put those elements in the game. I run a podcast with my wife called 50 Date Night Screams, and we try to provide content warnings for each movie we watch. But boy, is that a psychological dive, especially for movies that don't have it, right? So we're talking about movies from the 30s and the 40s. And you have to go, okay, someone might be offended by this or that, or upset, or be surprised, because cultural norms change, by the
Right.
way. But yeah, when you have this sort of male hum that everything is sort of like me, I think it's surprising when people have a problem with it, right? Because to your point, like, what do you mean? This is the way it's been. It's fine. And B, it can be jarring when someone says, "I would like to do something different," right? Which is certainly which I think is good. I think if any medium is going to grow, it's going to be exposed to more people. It's going to be more diverse. But when that happens, it does fluctuate and flex sort of the culture and the fandom, which I think is going on right now. Way more women, way more gender spectrum of folks who are gaming. Uh,
Mhm.
and the internet has made that possible, which is great. But that also means that a lot of the tropes and assumptions that were built in are being challenged. And for probably a good thing if you want to expand the game to audiences that were not the original audience. So I
Mm.
think it's healthy, but it is contentious when it happens because I think people are surprised that something they felt was sort of benign. And certainly there's the geek story, right? Like, oh, I was the guy who was picked on. So wait a minute, you're mad at me now? Um, feels different. So it's absolutely fascinating. One of the we talk about sort of sitting at the head of the table. Um, you talk a lot about DM habitus, if I'm saying that
Mhm.
right.
Yeah.
What is that? Could you go into sort of more detail on sort of what that is and what your
Sure.
research
So I'll
brought
give
up?
you the quick class on habitus.
Yeah,
Habitus was created.
professor, teach us free class. Please go ahead.
Habitus is created by a theorist, a sociologist by the name of Pierre Bourdieu. And habitus, it was originally designed to be these kind of involuntary and just natural actions that we have in society. These are things that individuals do without thinking. So it's sort of in social spaces, you come to understand these are the kind of bodily and cultural functions that you simply do. And what I talk about in DM habitus is that one thing that naturally falls to the DM as soon as they are placed in the role is that they have to navigate between three possible positions. And that is DM as collaborator, DM as supervisor, and DM as divinity. And the collaborator is recognizing that it's a story that's told by everyone, that the DM has set a roadmap, but that individuals can go off on a different direction. And and it can widen the map and it can make a greater story. But also DM is supervisor to recognize that you still have a tale you want to tell. So you have to direct individuals into a particular way and not do it in a way where individuals feel like they're losing their agency or they're losing their power. But then there is also DM as divinity, which is when DMs get frustrated. It's like, look, I'm in charge. And you're suddenly there because I say you're there. And or suddenly the deck of many things appears in front of you, and then you know you have really ticked off your DM. But it is recognizing that there is a balance between these. And historically, there's been more of a leaning towards one rather than the other. I think in the beginning of D&D, I think even Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson pushed this whole idea of DM as divinity. That this whole, you are the final word, you do everything you want to do, screw them. And one of the things I point out in the paper that I wrote on DM Habitus is I say that's true because they had very explicit rules on who could buy what books. And as such, that's like, if you aren't a DM, you shouldn't be reading this book. Like Monster Manual, when it was originally designed, was designed only for DMs. And that everything that individuals were supposed to know was supposed to be filtered through the DM. If all you wanted to be was the player, then you just have to listen to the DM because they are simply going to have a lot more information than you. Then there was a move more towards the idea of DM as supervisor. I think that came around like second edition. And there was more of a push towards, we're all working together and yeah, we've got some rules, but throw out the rules you don't need. Work towards what needs to happen in the group and just make the group whole. But that started to create something of a power differential. But at that point, there was still a reinforcement of that power differential. Once we get to 3.5 and definitely in 5, I try to pretend 4 didn't exist, but that's just me. I was one of the people who went to Pathfinder as soon as there was talk of 4, and it's like, no, no,
Yeah.
no, absolutely not. But there's more of an idea of a DM as collaborator, and that this is definitely a narrative that is told by multiple people. Actual play has, in its own way, reinforced that idea of collaboration and pushed back the idea of DM as divinity and DM as supervisor, and shown this as a more collaborative action. But what I talk about in the paper is it's got to be all three. That one of the things as a DM, you have to recognize that you can't be a 100% collaborator because people will go off the beaten path. I am the Miss Marple of any game, where I will come up with the most ridiculous conspiracy theory as to what happened and just go off in that direction, which makes perfect sense. And my DMs have always told me, your stories make sense, but that's not what I wrote. So we're not doing that. So we're going back. It's like, okay, you're piecing things together like you're Poirot, but no, you're piecing them together wrong. No, no. And it used to get annoying because we had a gaming group of like 7 people in a party, and I would convince them all. They're like, "Oh, he's right," and the DM's like, "No, no, he's wrong. No, no, this is absolutely not true." But but yeah, it's like maybe it's Tiamat. It could be Tiamat in disguise.
You
People are
sound
like,
like a delightful nightmare to play with. I quite a bit of fun, but probably completely derail everything everybody does, which is
correct.
fantastic.
And it's not on purpose. It's just the way my mind is constant. I watch too many British mysteries. My mind is constantly thinking from a logical point of view of what this could be. And it's always the person you least suspect. But at that time, the DM needs to either be a supervisor and say, nope, you're going this way, or be divinity and say, the person you don't think it is appears in front of you and says, it's not me, and then walks away. So it is about that balance, and it's hard to understand that balance. I mean, learning to be a DM is a process. And one of the things that we tend not to talk about in D&D is there are some people that never, ever, ever, ever want to be a DM. It looks intimidating. And it feels intimidating because it feels like in order to be the DM, you have to know everything. And I point out in the paper, rules lawyering and game splaining just presses on that to individuals so they feel like, oh, I don't know enough to argue against certain rules lawyers, so maybe this is not for me. But honestly, everybody muddles through. And what I write about is that there is just this balance between how you do it. And it is a learning process, and nowhere near as terrifying as people like to make it. That it is a skill. And being a DM is very much a flex. But learning how to balance that out, it takes people time, but it can be learned.
And it's an interesting, challenge. And I always try and look for other game mediums. I'm teaching the game design merit badge to our scout troop right now, and it's so fascinating to sort of pick at games and sort of what the foundational pieces of them. Because dungeon mastering, game mastering is both a vulnerability and a strength in the game, right? You're sort of the computer that runs a lot of this. You're the brain that's sort of doing so much. But you're sort of a player plus, right? You're not just a player. You're the player. The player knows to know their persona, their rules. You need to know all the rules theoretically. Now, of course, the reality is you don't. No DM does, and frankly, they just sort of they learn the rules as they go, and there's a lot of flexibility and sort of there's some planning certainly. But it's a real vulnerability to get the game going, right? This is the issue. I mean, you talked with Gygax and Arneson when you mentioned that challenge, which was very much, oh crap, we have to get these folks supported because the game doesn't happen without that person. You can always have players come in and out, but if you don't have that game master, that dungeon master, you really have a challenge. And it's always been an issue, I think, as long as the game's been around, which is you have this interesting world. First of all, as you mentioned, streaming actual plays have taken the mystery out of that because, again, that sort of happened at that person's house. And unless you were there, you had no idea what was going on. So we've blown that open, which is great. The mystery of it is off. I think the bigger challenge then is if I can do it, you can do it too, which hopefully streaming made more visible. I think the games always struggle with it. I think it will continue. Certainly, I see in comments all the time, oh, I wish I could play. I can't find a group. I can't find a DM. I've just started writing because Hasbro has CEO Chris Cox has mentioned it, and I am 100% convinced I'm right. We'll see how right I am. That they're going to start tinkering with AI in this
Mm,
space, and
yeah,
I think something's coming. And again, not doesn't have to be the level of flex that you're talking about, where there's you're going to be this sort of supervisor role. You probably just need to have an adventure where it takes you through enough of the stuff and maybe has a voice. But if you
right.
can do that, I think there's going to be an opportunity. Whether or not everybody's happy with it, that's a whole nother thing. And the disruption, social disruption, is not small. I mean, people are losing their minds at the thought of this happening. But I
Hmm.
think it's coming. I think it's
Yeah,
coming, and I think to your point, it's first of all, it shapes the culture, right? So again, head of the table sits at the table. If they're deity, literally, there is no way their biases and their perspectives don't affect the game.
absolutely. Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that's the same dialogue around AI, right? Which is what we're seeing is we have programmers putting AI in place, and they don't even realize that they are biasing them in ways that they program based on the data sets they have.
Right.
So it's sort of like same meet the DM, new DM, same as the old DM, just different problem, and it's not even a different problem. It's just maybe it's a robot versus a human.
Hmm.
Um, but it is certainly in some ways because role play is very much a human, right? This is not like a pure rule set. I think it very much is a reflection of the times, right? Because it's a reflection of us. It's if
Yeah.
there's some human players playing and there's some human game masters game mastering. If they're doing that, that's clearly going to be bump up against what's happening in the world. So, what's your perspective? I stopped asking about COVID. I used to ask about pandemic, and I think people it's a little bit different now. But in terms of the social issues you're seeing coming up in tabletop play, I mean, you're hitting a lot of different points. What do you see as sort of the challenges we are grappling with today that maybe either unexplored or we need to press on more, or hopefully we'll do better in the future?
So, a couple of things. Number one, I've started looking at actual play, and I wrote a paper that I'm about to send out for publication, which actually looks at actual play through the lens of reality television. And under the recognition that most actual play is people, what I used to say is people LARPing an actual game. That it is a realization that in many of the most popular actual play spaces, these people are actors. So part of this is acting and hamming it up. And
Mm-hmm.
we need to recognize that it is entertainment and not necessarily a quote unquote real game. I think the field has benefited from actual play because of the visibility that people see. Oh, well, you can have fun in a real game. It has definitely changed the metric. But one thing that has come up on Twitter over the last week or two is suddenly this pushback where new people are very nervous about going into D&D because they watch actual play and they're like, I'm not an actor. And they see all of this energy and they see all of this training and they see all of this skill at which these people are doing this, and they think it's just natural off the cuff. And there are new players who are saying, I can't do this. So I don't think I'm right for D&D. So there's this new message of like, no, it's fake, which is what I've been saying for the last 2 years. So I get my I told you so moment. But it is interesting that actual play is suddenly having this. They now refer to it as the Mercer effect,
Oh
where
yes, I've seen that. Yeah.
its popularity is starting to eat on itself to the point that what people are seeing, they are thinking is real, and that these individuals and how they are connecting to each other and to their fandom is real. So it leads to parasocial relationships. It leads to people who are now, I just heard this, that there's a big issue in parts of New York City where people who want to improve their gaming are going to improv lessons because the idea is like, oh, well, D&D has always been improv. And I'm sitting here thinking, no, it really hasn't, but sure, whatever. So it is kind of desegregating, or at least trying to disentangle this idea of what is the impact of actual play on the gaming culture? Because I think it's starting to have a deeper effect that's going to be it's going to be really, really interesting to see how it progresses. So I'm watching actual play very closely in terms of how it deeply affects the culture. The benefit of actual play is that a lot of actual play shows that are popular, like Dimension 20, are very diverse. So people are seeing individuals at the table in a very diverse way. But yeah, there are some things of question in actual play that I think are going to be some of the next elements that I look at in terms
I,
of,
no, I was just going to say my three favorite words is Critical Role socks.
oh my
That's
gosh.
I saw socks on sale next to Dungeons and Dragons, and it was Critical Role. And that at that moment, before the cartoon came out, I was like, oh, okay, this is now a cultural force to be reckoned with in a way that is outshining the game. Frankly, it's so big. It's not just about D&D anymore, right?
Correct.
But wow, I was like, socks? Okay, we are at sock level of popularity, and it was hanging on the shelf next to a D&D book, and I said, got it, noted.
Wow.
Mike,
Wow.
they have far more merchandise than just socks.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, but I mean that's like it's not like a D&D, like it's not dice, it's not a character. It was like socks. Okay, so now we've blown into a new dimension of yeah, way bigger than geekdom. I'm wearing dragon socks right now. So but it was just funny because it's like, oh yeah, it's that popular that you get your own socks. Yeah, that's a different realm that we're playing in. That's funny. Yeah, so I mean, to your point, uh it is theater of theater, which is sort of fascinating, right? So you've got streaming and it's streaming of games. And certainly, there's certainly some of us who are like, that's not what my game looks like. And there's certainly
Yes.
some of us who are, like you said, it's just Monty Python jokes for like an hour. So really, really challenging and interesting because this is us growing up, right? This is the game
Yeah.
now living in the virtual space and the online space and the community space, right? So Dungeons and Dragons started, obviously you got, for me, it was high school, lots of colleges. It was all these sort of subcultures, but they were very physically localized plus conventions and fanzines. But now we're starting to get into the phase of internet culture exclusively. That's enormous potentially at
Yeah.
scale, right? And like you said, fandoms who are having parasocial relationships with these actors, who are actors, by the way, as awesome as they
Mhm.
are, but they are actors. Um, and in it, what hopefully is mostly a virtuous cycle, but it's certainly now I think this is where like, is Marvel movies about the comics anymore? Do they even tell you to read them? Um,
No.
they don't, right? It's sort of like, yeah, we know we took it from there, but we frankly don't even care if you read it anymore. And I feel like
No.
there's sort of that world that we're starting to get into that it's almost morphed into its own, it's moved beyond sort of its roots. So it's sort of fascinating. And almost every streaming group seems to start with D&D and then go, yeah, we don't need D&D. We're going to make our own game.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a really interesting point because there's always this there has always been historically, and it's gotten more prominent in since the advent of fifth edition games or fifth edition that people are saying, well, it doesn't have to be D&D. There's a
Right.
bigger push towards play something other than D&D, that
Mm-hmm.
D&D is outsized. They have taken the lion's share of the market and they've done this and they've done that and they're pushing out other games. And I've always been somewhat critical of that argument because I mean, I started playing D&D in 1986, 1987. I see what D&D has been through. And there were some really hard times throughout the Satanic Panic where
Yep.
second edition AD&D is nothing but a partial capitulation to the idea of let's remove demons and devils. Let's not talk about gods until we get a little bit down the road. Let's take out everything and keep the game so we can at least try to make people sort of happy. And to see all of the gesticulations that D&D had to go through for at least the 40 years I saw, it's kind of like when they've reached this point of a renaissance, and people are like, wow, it doesn't have to be about D&D. I'm like, no, I'm fine with it being about D&D, because D&D earns its moment in the spotlight. It really, really does, because there was a time when it was really the only one taking the brunt of everything. I'm sorry, but Tom Hanks was not making movies talking about how horrible Werewolf the Apocalypse was, but he
Right.
was making a movie talking about or demonstrating in whatever uh, allusions to D&D. There were not chick tracks written about Twilight 2000, but there was a pretty notable one about Dungeons and Dragons.
Hmm.
So I recognize what they've gone through, and that's why I'm less sensitive to that argument. But your point is valid in that um, the game is changing, and so the challenges that are going to be approaching in this next 50 years is they're going to be completely different than some of the challenges that we have seen throughout the first 50 years. Like back in the old days, when could anybody get to Lake Geneva to get to Gen Con? Now Gen Con is so popular that, and I can say this from experience because I'm going to my first Gen Con this year.
Oh, exciting.
The downtown, they opened up hotels on Sunday about a month ago. Downtown hotels sold out in 90 minutes.
Yep.
It was unbelievable. It was faster than they even thought. They were like, oh, they'll sell out around 4 or 5. It was faster than they even thought. So it's just a huge difference and a huge change.
Yeah, there's a phrase. It was in one of the older magazines that there was a comment about it. Um, Timothy Hutchins, who ran a Kickstarter on, I think it was Oracle magazine. I think I'm saying that right. And the intro, I don't remember who wrote it. And they said Dungeons and Dragons is a tool that makes more Dungeons and Dragons. That's the secret. It's not about how you play it, because people didn't know how to play it, by the way. They were not really, initially, there weren't rules of how to play it. It was sort of, but it's a tool that lets you make more of it, more
Mm-hmm.
monsters, more games, more stories. So in a lot of ways, that's worked wonderfully. People have hated the game and made their own game. They've made fantasy heartbreakers of it, but it's always yours. It's not
Right.
really a carbon. Even when it is, when you use an adventure, it's not a carbon copy of the game. So it that ability to self propagate, it's like a mental virus, right? And now it's loose on the internet, and it's
Yeah.
roaming free. And what a
Yes, it
time to
is.
be alive
Yeah.
to see that happen in a positive way. We got plenty of negative mind viruses running around, but this one I'll take, which is that creativity and adventure and hopefully camaraderie and partnership is seen as a positive thing. And to your point, why wouldn't it be diverse and welcoming, right? You could be anything, but oh yeah, not you. But why wouldn't it be? You could be anything, right? And if you could be anything, anybody should be able to play it. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
So I want to be sensitive to time. We actually have several folks on. I will. So if you're okay, we'd like to open it up to those questions, and then we'll come back around and sort of wrap up with anything else that we missed. So Ted, I see you've unmuted. Did you have a question?
Yeah. um, so you kind of talked about uh, the masculine framework in RPG culture, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so if let's say hypothetically uh, RPGs had gotten a different origin story, uh, and it was a female framework for RPGs culture, what would that actually be?
No, it's a really good question. And so one of the things I talk about in my research when people think I'm like damning games or anything by this masculine culture and this development of masculine culture, it's not necessarily because of the fact that it was started by men. It's the fact that we exist in kind of a hegemonic culture where a lot of things are based in masculine concepts. What would a game system look like if it were not started in a hegemonic system? Everybody's tried to like speculate what that is like. But one of the things that we note is that you can see these threads of like of masculinity that are not so much because there is a lot of critique that people offer to the creators of D&D, but I want to point out that they were pulling a lot of their information from history, from fables, from anthropological knowledge and historical knowledge. And a lot of that was written from a very male-centric point of view. So it is no mistake that the game takes on these elements. I just did a presentation at a class at Morgan State today and talked about how one of the key elements of D&D is the hero's journey. And the hero's journey is based around kind of like the male hero. And so there's going to be this element that's going to be very masculine. I really, really, really don't know what a feminist version of the game or the gaming culture would look like. It's kind of a little bit of a stretch, but I know that there was a movement in terms of erotica where they're like, oh, well, we're going to make feminist erotica from the female gaze. And oddly enough, it looks a lot like male erotica. So it's like, I don't necessarily understand it, except to say that I feel like, and Bourdieu would agree with this, our ideas about what are historically right are so embedded in us that even when we try to make something different, it still has elements of the sameness. So honestly, I think that if this game were started by two women, it would still have, and it would still have some elements of this kind of male preserve, mainly because one of the draws is it pulls from history and it pulls from pieces of pop culture that people know. And those pieces are heavily impacted by stories that have existed in the past that are definitely male-centric.
Excellent. Other questions? David, you're up.
Thank you so much for this. It's just endlessly fascinating. For someone like me, who wants to keep up with your work, what is I know you publish in various places and things, but what's the best way to keep up with what you're currently working on or currently publishing?
Ooh, so you can go to my academia.edu page. I put everything that I can legally post for free. I post up there, but the things I can't, you have the ability to just send me a message and I will just send you a copy. I am all about sharing. I have physical copies of everything I've ever published, and within 24 hours of getting your request for anything that is not physically up there, I will absolutely send it to you. So that's the best. I even put like presentations I've done. I put them up there too. So the PDFs of those are up there. So individual, I'll go find the direct link. And I'll put it in the chat so people can go. But yeah, that's probably the best way.
Terrific. Thank you.
Fantastic. David runs our newsletter. He's always looking for good stuff.
Okay, excellent.
Excellent. Okay, so well, thank you, David. That was one of my questions. So yeah, for sure, we'll definitely want to connect to you. So what's up next in your future? You're going to Gen Con. Are you going as a presenter? Is that what you're doing? Or are you just attending?
Yes and no. So yes, I'm going as a presenter, but I'm also going with an organization called Bringing Fire, and I want to give them a plug. They're doing a GM 101 where they actually take groups of people and teach them how to be game masters. And
Great.
it's kind of a collaborative study. It's a collaborative effort where people get into groups, people do a little bit of GMing, and then they're offered critique by subject matter experts who talk about this is what you can do, here's some other things you can do. So you're learning by group, but it's also, so it's very much collaborative, but teaching individuals how to be supervisor and tamping down on that whole divinity unless you need to have it. So it's going to be a great opportunity. I'm going to be working with some amazing people, and I'm really excited to do that. So yeah, I think that's the only gaming thing. Oh, I'll be at BlurredCon, which is which is a gaming and anime and comic conference that occurs in Northern Virginia. I think I'm going to be on a panel talking about masculinity and gaming. So those are the only two gaming related conferencing things I'm doing.
It's exciting. Yeah, we talk about this and I keep bringing it up and we haven't been able to make it work, partially because my son's birthday falls during Gen Con.
Ah,
And I've been like, buddy, would it be okay if we went for Gen? So I got him to agree. Of course, he's about to go to college now, so but we just can't swing it. And to your point about booking, like I can't deal with. I slept in one hotel that was next to the airport, and that means you get earplugs, which I thought was a
wow.
joke, and it's not a joke. So yeah, I was like, I don't know if I can do that, but I used to go every year as a journalist, actually, and I love absolutely. You're gonna absolutely love it. It's gonna be amazing. So how can we support you? Like, what can we do? I mean, obviously, your work. Look, we could have even easily spent an hour on one of these topics. We only scratched the surface. You are certainly, I feel like you're limitlessly and unbound in your approach, which I think is fantastic. It's not like you're just like you said, like there's some gaming thing. I know you're doing other stuff, right? But how can we support you? I think this is what you're doing is hugely important. Probably in some cases challenged, I imagine, in the popular sphere. So I can't imagine. You must have some tough days. I feel like when stuff
Yeah,
goes out and
yeah, with respect, lots of people have tougher days than me. I mean,
yeah, true. Yeah, put it in perspective. Yeah.
I had a piece that was published in, I think, The Conversation. No, was it The Conversation? No, I was interviewed by NPR and I was talking about my experiences as a gamer. And I was saying something about like my theories of the male preserve and how difficult it could be for women. I got an email from England of someone attacking me saying, "You don't understand." It was a woman attacking me saying that you don't understand what it's like. It's actually easier for women to play these games. You're making it sound like it's harder than it is. I'm like, this is not the attack I thought I was going to get.
Yep.
But
Yeah.
okay, all right. So yeah, yeah, those are kind of the, and then I was published in PBS NewsHour did a piece again talking about gaming. They interviewed me and several people who know a lot more about gaming in academia than I do. And I did get a little bit of harsh treatment from individuals on Twitter. I said something about OSR, and that was the worst thing to
Oh,
do.
Lord.
So, so suddenly I get all of these messages like, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" So I just I stepped away from Twitter for like a month and
What
said
did,
I just can't.
what did you say?
I said that in some OSR communities, individuals fall into these spaces where they talk about issues of like, not in my game, or you're ruining my game, and saying that this can occur in OSR spaces. Somehow people took it to say this is all of OSR, and I'm like, no, no, I never said this was all of OSR. That old school Renaissance is about an appreciation of old styles, but similar to the idea that there is the possibility of finding individuals who really are like segregationists at a reenactment. You can find individuals who are not necessarily thrilled about diversity in OSR. That those spaces that prize history can sometimes be attractive to individuals who think that things should go back the way they were. That's basically the point that I was making. But yeah.
That sounds like Twitter bait for sure. Because all it has to do would be taken out of context and then turn
Yeah.
into a keyword search. But yeah, so well, I'm excited. I think this is fantastic. I'm excited for all the work you're doing. Like I said, I really feel bad because in some ways we need 2-3 hours to just cover even a third of the things that you're talking about. I just want to talk about bronies, honestly, just because but we're not going to get there. And I'm thrilled to see the work that you're doing. So you said you got some papers coming. What was this? Can you give us a sneak preview on that and on what you're working on?
Sure. I have one paper that's talking, well, actually one paper that's talking about like that fringe OSR group. And in that paper, I more distinctly defined because we constantly use the term murder hobo, but
Yep.
nobody's really academically defined murder hobo. So
Hmm.
I worked with some individuals that have actually talked about murder hobo in academia. And it's like, okay, these are the three elements of the murder hobo campaign. And so that's something that I can't wait for that paper because I'm really excited that that when people are doing my memorial in 50 years, somebody's going to say, he's the one that pre-developed murder.
Find the murder.
Yes, yes, yes. That's what I want on my obituary. That's what I did. Let's see what else. I did a survey about a year and a half ago looking at issues of time displacement and based on gender, as in what pulls people away from the gaming table.
Hmm.
And the theory I went under was that because there are more domestic responsibilities for women, they would be more likely to have things that pull them away from the game table, and they would have far more deeper feelings about being pulled away from the game table. And I put out this survey. I was like, okay, I'll get 200 people maybe. And my mentor during my postdoc was like, 200, 250 is fine. I got 850 people,
Wow.
which was great. The survey was only up for about 8 hours, or I was going to say 8 hours. Geez, it was only up for about a month, and it was not a short survey. So
Hmm.
getting that many people was great. Some of the preliminary data shows that what my theory was is actually proven. I mean, there was a qualitative part where individuals were asked, would you feel guilty or do you feel guilty when you have to not show up at the game or leave the game? And it's interesting that nearly 75% of the individuals that identified themselves as women said that they would feel very guilty
Hmm.
for. Whereas, what was it? 67, yeah, 2/3 exactly, percent of the men said, you know what? It's a game. Everybody knows that this is a possibility. And if you got to go, you got to go because you have a life. But it is not to say that men in those responses valued the game any less. It is simply that because of this idea of abandoning individuals that tends to be gender programmed into young girls, that there's this feeling of like I'm letting people down when I'm
Mm-hmm.
not at the table, where that's not necessarily the, I mean, it's leisure. It's supposed to be fun. It's not supposed to be stressful.
My gaming group is only three men and four women, all over more, these are married women or women with children. And it's just amazing. It's amazing, different dynamic, for sure. And it's as my wife says, she's like, I wouldn't play any other way. She loves, the gender mix and sort of how we play. But it is fascinating because it's hard to imagine, right? So here I am now, decades later, and going, oh yeah, like not only a gender mix, not only a balanced gender mix, an actual more women than men gender mix, which I couldn't even conceive
Yeah.
before. So times have changed. And to your point, with them comes things that probably were always there, right? So if women felt constrained, that was, but now you're seeing it because they're gaming when they're more visible, and you're like, oh yeah, that affects everybody and how they engage. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
All this stuff. I can't imagine it's suddenly new. It's just that
Yeah.
because gaming has come to encompass much of the internet and the world, we're now seeing it through the gaming lens and going, oh yeah, yeah, that's a problem too. Or we've struggled with that. Or yeah, that's an interesting issue as to why it, never was addressed. So,
Right.
um, this has been amazing. I want to be sensitive to your time. Thank you so much.
Sure. My
Again, we
pleasure.
could easily go longer.
Yep.
Um,
I put in my email. So if anybody
yes.
has any questions about anything, feel free to reach out to me. I am available to talk about anything. I'm available to talk to anybody about anything. No, I do not charge because I feel like if you want the information, I'm here to give it free of charge. So
Well, you've got a
feel free.
huge fan base in the I'm sure almost everybody in our group for sure in the CAR-PGA would love to support you. So if you have surveys or you need help, by all means, this is our invitation to use us for that purpose. We'd happy to get the word out for future studies or anything else you're working on. By all means, please keep us up to date. David runs the newsletter. What I'll do is I'll do a summary of this conversation. We'll make sure we get your website in there. Well, if I a little nervous about putting your email in there, but maybe we'll check to make sure you want to put your email in.
Yeah, well, I'll be fine.
But yeah, and we can do all that and make sure everybody has a chance to contact you. Anything else I missed? Anything that you wanted to cover before we wrap up?
No, nothing on my end. No, thank
Well,
you for
it's been a pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank
same.
you. Don't
Thank
go
you.
anywhere. I'm going to just stop the recording.
Okay.
But thank you again for your time. We really appreciate it. We'll make sure we get all this wrap up. There's plenty of articles we can link to. There's probably like 6 easily. And we may take you up on the offer to look at some of that in PDF format too, because I'd love to read some of those that I don't have access to. So thank you so much for being a guest today.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.